And I think no one would predict that we'd actually be recommending that they take advice from Yu-Gi-Oh. But
Okay,
you were telling me this idea, and I think it's not a bad idea.
Distraction makers.
Okay, so we're going to talk today about parasitic design, which is a strange term. I heard about it quite a long time ago. Mark Rosewater labels particular mechanics as parasitic.
Yeah.
We'll define what that is in a moment, I suppose. But I think in general, the idea that something is like calling something parasitic seems inherently negative when it kind of isn't. So, all right, let's define.
Most people don't like parasites.
Right, that's usually a bad thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's define a parasitic mechanic, a parasitic design, maybe, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a mechanic, which we'll talk about more.
Right, and we were looking this up before because we were wondering, like, where the hell did this term come from? We're pretty sure it came from an architectural design term, which is apparently it is a term in architectural design for when you have a primary building and then you have a secondary building or other buildings built off of that main building. And that's essentially what parasitic design is. Most people, how they refer to it, is that it is a design that's isolated to its block or set.
Right.
That mechanic or design or keyword or whatever was set in.
Right. So some of the, I guess, more famous examples, which we'll talk about some of this stuff more in depth, but horsemanship is up there on the list, as well as shadow, which is just basically the same thing almost as horsemanship.
Right.
And then something like splice into or onto arcane.
You would know more than I would.
Splice into arcane.
I didn't play Kamigawa.
I'm not gonna look it up. I'm just gonna declare that it is into arcane.
Yeah. Do you want to do it one more take and just say it really confidently?
Yeah. Okay. It's onto arcane.
Wait.
This way I can cut to which one's the correct one. Okay. Anyway. So okay. So actually, the original Kamigawa block, full of these sort of parasitic designs that only real and like it almost made sense for the theme of that set because it was so separate from what Magic had done up to that point that I think the designers really were thinking, okay, how do we make sure that the set feels particularly unique? Yeah. And it does. It feels very unique.
Had like Soul Shift and the offering cards or whatever.
Right. There's like offerings and Soul Shift and even something like ninjutsu, right? The mechanic itself, not necessarily parasitic, but the name of it is so stuck with ninjas that like that's it. That's what ninjas do. And something that might kind of be like a ninja can't do this because it's called ninjutsu.
Right.
So,
unfortunately.
Whoops. Anyway, so I think the idea of we have a mechanic that is attached to this larger set for thinking about in terms of the architecture metaphor. We have the big building, which is the set. We have the small building that's attached to it, which is the parasitic mechanic. But what's interesting about this in the Magic design space is that a mechanic, like this is sort of a sliding scale, right? Where a mechanic can be more or less parasitic over time. Well, probably not more over time. I think it can only become less parasitic over time as more support for this type of thing is printed. So if you look at horsemanship only, it's basically a flying equivalent where you can't block a creature that has horsemanship unless you have horsemanship.
Right.
And what ends up happening in that interaction is that there's not that many horsemanship cards. Like it was a mechanic made for, well, a keyword, I guess, made for Portal 3 Kingdoms, which was a small set that was targeted towards I think an Asian demographic. And that was it until, I guess sort of recently, whether some reprints, I don't know, whatever.
And Commander, stuff.
But I think that's what's kind of funny too, is that like, in the Commander space, a lot of these sort of parasitic mechanics show up as ways to kind of like circumvent interaction in the game. Horsemanship being a great example. So is Shadow. That basically just say unblockable in most instances because nobody else is running anything with Shadow or anything with horsemanship.
Right. The thing that we kept running into, I mean, we talked for like an hour before even recording this because it was that much, like not debate, but just trying to figure out like what the hell does this mean?
Yeah.
Is parasitic design is probably not a great name for this. And and that we found there's a lot of crossover in what people discuss online, and that they'll discuss parasitic design and they'll use other types of designs that aren't necessarily parasitic.
Right.
But I think we chunked it to it's linear design, and then narrow design, and then parasitic design.
Right.
And I think
these are different things.
These are different things.
But sometimes they have overlap.
And there's overlap in that, like, something can be parasitic and linear, or something can be parasitic and narrow.
Right.
But, like, it's very different. And I think some people keep lumping this in. I think part of it is because parasitic design is just not the best. It's not the best term. It's a little confusing. It's like unexpanded upon design is kind of what we ended up landing on.
It's probably a good way to describe it. Yeah.
But whereas linear design, that's like tribal cards. That's like this card only does something if you also have elves in your deck. It's like, well, that's the only thing you can do. You have to have elves or you don't get this thing. That's a very straightforward path.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be tribal specific either. It could be like strategy specific, like this card interacts with cycling, or this card interacts with flashback, or something like that.
Yeah. And then you have narrow design space, and this is usually where there's some sort of a mechanic, keyword, function in the game that like just doesn't have a lot of room to grow. And the one that I always think of is Mark Rosewater talked about Cypher in Ravnica, in the first Ravnica set, and that like Cypher doesn't really have a lot of places that it can grow into. Cypher, for those that don't know, is basically it's a spell. Once you cast it, you can
encode. You can
encode it. You don't enchant it. You encode it onto a target creature, and then every time that creature deals combat damage or attacks, one of the two, I don't remember, you can then cast that encoded spell for free. Encoding is not a thing. I don't think it was a thing until this card. Maybe I'm wrong. No. And it's just like you get that spell and then you cast it again. Yeah. But as far as I know, there's not like creatures that say like once a card's encoded on me or anything like that. Yeah. So there really just wasn't a lot to move with that mechanic.
Yeah.
And that's a narrow design space.
Right. Yeah. And like I said, there's sort of some of the worst parasitic design offenders, I think, are at this intersection where these ideas overlap, right? So we have like narrow design space, like you said, we have linear design space, and we have parasitic design, where if we look at something like Ripple, which is from Cold Snap, which is really cool to play in a draft environment, by the way, because you can play in draft. If you draft more than 4 copies of a card, you can play all the copies. You don't have to limit it to 4.
So you draft the red spell Ripple, whatever.
Yeah, and so you cast it once, and then it goes down in your deck, finds another one, cast that one, goes down in your deck, finds the next one, and you can sort of just like ripple through your whole deck. Yeah, which I think is very thematic to what this mechanic is trying to do. It's kind of like bad Cascade in a way, right?
Right.
But that particular mechanic, not only is it parasitic because it really only exists in Cold Snap, and there's not really a whole lot of support for Ripple, but there just isn't as much design space there because the more things with Ripple that you make, is it only the card? Maybe it's only the card. It's only that specific card?
It's only that specific card.
Okay, well, you can't even ripple into a different card,
right,
so there's literally no more design space there. Anyway, so...
Now you could do Ripple into Arcane.
Right.
Oh.
Okay, now we're getting
so. Sorry. Ripple onto Arcane.
Oh, hey.
Thank you.
I don't remember which one it is.
I don't know.
Okay, so basically you have 2 options when you're working in an eternal world like we are with Magic, is that you can make things more powerful or you make things more unique. And so with parasitic design, one way to be able to make things that are new and interesting is that you kind of have to print things as the enabler and the payoff, which we have described as the everything bagel cards.
Which we do have in an episode, don't we?
Yeah, we have it in an episode, yeah.
What episode was that?
I don't know. It's back there somewhere. So I think this is why we're seeing that kind of thing more often. It's a little weird when it comes up when it's not really in parasitic design territory. But there's like one of the energy cards. I'll bring it up or whatever. But that basically creates energy and then also uses energy with its ability. And that, I think, is a good way to kind of circumvent the problems that can arise when you're creating like you're working in parasitic design land and you're trying to come up with this new space to explore, but you don't have enough support yet within the game.
And Mark Rosewater's talked about this too, where he says like venturing into the dungeon he considers as like soft parasitic, because you can't get the most benefit because you can't venture. You have to, in order to venture into the dungeon, basically you get a dungeon and every time you do it you go further into it, and it's on this little card. And so most dungeons are like 3 to 5 spaces before you finish the dungeon, something like that.
3 is like the very fast, the most fast. I think it's about 4 on
4
average.
Is average.
Yeah.
But anytime you venture into the dungeon or in any space in it, you get a bonus. You get a benefit, not a bonus, but something happens.
Yeah.
Every single time. And so technically you could have one card that ventures into the dungeon, and no matter what, something will happen because you ventured into that dungeon, which is why he doesn't consider it to be totally parasitic, because you still actually get some of the function of the card on its own. It's not reliant on these other things.
Right. And I think it's interesting when we compare that to something like food tokens, where, when it first was introduced, it was, pretty parasitic in that I think it was only in Eldraine, and we had a few cards that interacted with food tokens. But over time, we've gotten a lot more things that interact with food tokens. I want to touch on Commander a little bit here. We're not going to.
What are you going to say? Are you going to say something good?
I don't know.
Do you like Commander now?
What do you think? Do you really think I'm going to say something good?
No.
So part of the weirdness with designing for Commander and designing for an Eternal World is that when you introduce new mechanics or new places where the game can go, you can't really reach a saturation point right away where you can kind of build a Commander deck around that kind of thing, right? So when we look back at some of these really interesting decks that came out of the standard environment, enough support for that type of mechanic was printed within the set that you could build a deck around it.
Right.
One of my favorites being Astral Slide, which is an enchantment that whenever you cycle a card, you can remove a creature from the game, and it comes back at the end of the turn. And then there was a lot of cycling cards in there, and it created a really interesting deck.
In that particular set, you could play that, and that set had support, so it made this deck archetype work.
And the thing that was so cool about it to me is that this allows you to create really new and interesting play patterns in a very short window of time, right?
We were talking about this earlier, that like I didn't play the Kamigawa set, but when you were showing me stuff like Soul Shift or Offering or Splice into Arcana, I was like, oh, that seems like it'd be really cool to play.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's all within Kamigawa. Like you're in Kamigawa land. And it also, I think, really helps give sets an identity, right?
Yeah.
Like these play patterns are how people are experiencing the set in real time. And so you get into this mode where, okay, we're in Commander land now. Sets are being introduced, and they're being introduced just to the environment with all the other cards from 30 Years of Magic, and it's like throwing a pebble into the ocean a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And so there's like a new, like with food, right? Food comes out, the pebble is thrown into the ocean, and now we have a few food cards, and like maybe a few of them are seeing any kind of play in Commander.
Now we have a lot of food cards.
Right. Yeah. And so the thing that becomes interesting is, in order to make some kind of an impact on Commander and make it so that players can sort of have enough support to play these cards, because you can't play 4 copies of any of the cards. It's got to be all one-ofs. So it takes a long time to build up that amount of support by throwing tons of pebbles into the ocean until eventually you form a little island that you can. This metaphor is ridiculous,
but
it's
good.
Anyway, so you see what I'm saying, right? Where it is challenging to introduce new levers for the game when you have to print so many of them. And the other thing that's a little weird, and I'm not sure if I'm the only one that's feeling this, but you almost get like food fatigue, right? Where you've seen this thing come up so often now that you're like, what's with all the food stuff?
I was kind of thinking about this last, God, what was the set? Oh, Murders at Carlisle Manor. I was seeing more and more cards that still like also kind of mentioned, I think there's a couple cards that talk about food in it, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm mistaken because
Could be clues.
I know clues is for sure in there, but it might just be because Standard has so many sets right now that I just think that food tokens are in it. But I was just surprised to see it even in like the Lord of the Rings set and the new Eldraine set.
Yeah.
Right. When it was like in both of those, I was like, oh, there's like a lot of food right now. Like this is so it just seemed strange, seemed like out of place a little bit.
What I think that was so interesting is like you can kind of see this buildup of food over time. And then you get to Lord of the Rings, and suddenly we have like food commanders, and like that's when you know, okay, Wizards is seeing this mechanic as hitting enough of a saturation point that they can make a commander that cares about food, right? So maybe we've reached food. Maybe we're full. You know?
There you go. That's a nice way of wrapping it up. But so I think the thing that we were kind of discussing that is it's unfortunate. Because I think it's kind of what's happening right now is like it's obvious to everybody. Commander, #1 format right now. It's how most people are playing. I'm not going to be shitting on Commander. Right? I'm just saying.
Look, to be clear, I'm not trying to shit on Commander.
Yeah, you hate Commander.
I am merely pointing out that it creates new design challenges that require innovative solutions.
And I think that we're going to discuss some of those possibilities and like why they might be going in this direction is because you're right. Like now they have a new problem to solve. Something that we're seeing now, like we're seeing it kind of in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, is like if you look at the design philosophies between like early Kamigawa and Outlaws of Thunder Junction, you'll see like Kamigawa was filled with these different mechanics. And it's like you were talking about is like it was kind of a cool thing when playing that set. And now you can't play it in an eternal format where you can play any cards because there's not enough support for it. But in like something like Outlaws, like I'm pretty sure every single mechanic that's come out for that set is not in a parasitic design space. And that like everything about it is something that functions right away or has enough support around it already from existing cards. And so it's good in a way because it means that all of these cards can now be played in all of these other formats, like Commander, perfectly fine. But I think that what it's missing is it's missing some of that opportunity that something like Kamigawa had where it can get so precise and specific and just kind of like, I want to say like playful about its design, that it's like, it's this new toy, it's this new toy box, and like it might not be the best toy or whatever, and it might not go into these other sets, but it's something that's very specific to this set and this specific time.
Right.
And that's really cool. Like I think that's neat.
And I think this is what's so funny about committing a crime, right? When we look at like this new mechanic keyword, I don't know, it's somewhere in between
phrase.
Right. And we look at it being something called committing a crime, but being something so generic.
We should probably explain what committing a crime is.
Okay, let's do that real quick. So committing a crime literally is targeting any of your opponent's stuff during gameplay, right?
Right.
And I'm pretty sure it's everything, but I'm not 100% sure that it's everything.
Yeah.
That it's like cards in graveyard, cards on battlefield, cards in hand?
Is it targeting your opponent directly?
Targeting your opponent directly? I don't know. Look, it's a little... this isn't even really the point. Like, well, I'll put a card up there. So, the weirdness for me with committing a crime isn't that it's... It is interesting design space that hasn't been explored. The thing that's weird about it to me is that it's named something so specific, but the interaction itself is so generic that the actual like thing that you're doing doesn't feel like what it's called, right?
Right.
You're like, okay, I'm just playing the game. I'm targeting stuff. I'm now committing a crime by doing. I've literally been playing Magic for 30 years and never thought about this kind of interaction in that context. But now I'm thinking, am I actually thinking about it in a new context, or is it just the name of the thing I'm doing has changed, right?
Right.
Does that change the feeling of what I'm doing? Not really. It just changes what it's called in Thunder Junction, right? Yeah. And I'm wondering too a couple things. One, are they naming this in a way so that they can do something similar to this later again, but they get sort of that almost parasitic payoff here in that they're naming it something very flavorful to the set, but it's something that isn't limited within Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Like if you play a card that wants you to commit a crime, you can commit a crime with any card in Magic ever that targets some of your opponent's things. So it's keeping it very broad, but still thematic when it's now for this particular card from Thunder Junction committing a crime.
Right?
Sure. Okay. That maybe you get to have your cake and eat it too, but the way that this mechanic for me resonates, it's almost like that ludonarrative dissonance thing that we talk about, right? Where you've now created the narrative, which is that this is committing a crime, but you didn't really make do any of the mechanical groundwork stuff in the way that
to make it really feel like you're committing a crime.
Yeah. Right.
To capture the actual essence and experience.
Instead, you have to stay in this very generic land of design space to make sure that this thing can be utilized in an eternal setting.
Which is, it's funny because I understand why they had to do that. I think it's a difficult design challenge that they're, I cannot stress this enough that like when we complain about Magic or Commander or any of these formats or anything like that, it's not like, oh, why can't they fix this? And it really bothers me when like I think a lot of people online kind of say stuff like that, and you're just like, this is easy. Like, how do they not do this? They're making so many cards, guys. This is very different. Many cards for so many formats. And everyone, like, if you go and you watch YouTubers, right, and you watch other Magic YouTubers that are probably much better than we are, if you go and do that and watch people that, like, talk about Legacy versus talk about Modern versus talk about this, everyone has a different opinion on what they think Magic should be doing. Yeah. And, like, most of them are wrong. And, like, it's insane because I think they're in a tough spot. So as much as I could say that, oh, I really want them to design this very specific experience for that specific set, right? I would love it if it felt more like you have a little bit more ludonarrative associated with committing a crime, right? That it really feels like that. But that gets into more specific design space that then maybe is going to make it not as attractive for an Eternal format. Eternal formats are where most people play it, so no one's going to buy this set. And, like, it's just, and then, then their stock goes down. Like,
well, and it has to be something so open-ended enough that, like, you can sort of, like, make the scaffolding and then hang stuff on it over time, like food, right? Food's a great way, exploration of what we're talking about. But I think if we look at parasitic design, and we try to imagine what it could be like in a more eternal world. I think one of the things that is sort of that we're losing by doing this is things that, like we say, feel very specific to a particular type of deck and create a very unique play style. And so, we're going to be a couple of those YouTubers maybe for a minute that have ideas of what Magic could do, and maybe we're wrong, but from our sort of semi-informed perspective, I think that we can kind of look to some other card games, right? Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a card game that has existed in an eternal environment its entire existence.
And I think no one would predict that we'd actually be recommending that they take advice from Yu-Gi-Oh! But okay, you were telling me this idea, and I think it's not a bad idea.
We're not exactly saying to do what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is doing.
Make a Blue Eyes deck.
Right. So Yu-Gi-Oh! Has these cards that are designed in a way that are meant to be played in a very specific archetype, right? And Blue Eyes is one of the archetypes, so they have something that's like, okay, well, you can play this card that draws 2 cards as long as you have Blue Eyes on the field or whatever. So basically, you have to play this in a Blue Eyes specific deck. So it got us thinking about, well, what does Magic have in terms of scaffolding for this, right? They have the colors, which is they already take full advantage of. But the other thing that they have that they aren't really taking advantage of is planes of existence. And if you potentially could utilize planes of existence to make things that are not so narrow that would need to be played with a specific commander.
You should also specify planes of existence as in like the planes, as in like you have the Ravnica plane. Yes. So there's multiple sets that are on the Ravnica plane. Right. And so, yeah.
So one way, like what we're saying, where you could get a little bit of the specificity that parasitic design gets you, with maintaining its playability immediately, right, is that you could limit some powerful card designs to specific planes of existence, so that you would have to play, or at least to get full effect of the card, you would have to be playing a commander that's from that plane of existence. Yeah. And this is very commander specific design, and maybe that doesn't it's weird if we're making cards that are like, well, this is just meant to be played in commander. Well, obviously that happens already, but they're not quite as specific about it.
Right. This would be definitely the most specific type of it's a triangle piece fitting into a triangle hole, right, basically. But I think that how you get around it is, we had talked about, okay, so you have planes of existence, But I think as long as you follow this new sort of philosophy of making sure that it's not so parasitic that it will do a thing. Every card has to do a thing. But if you have a commander that is part of the Ravnica plane or part of this plane or whatever, it will do that thing plus some.
More. Yeah.
And so, one, it means that it can't be printed in standard. That's not the thing.
Right. This type of idea almost necessitates an eternal format,
right?
Which is pretty interesting, right? That's almost like exploring this design space from the other end, right? Where we've been so much in standard land of this is how we do this kind of thing in a non-eternal format, is that we can print these sort of parasitic mechanics and they fade away and come back, and we can reach a particular level of saturation because you can play 4 copies in your deck. Okay, well, what happens if you can't do any of that? How do we get back a little bit of that idea?
Right. And I think that what Yu-Gi-Oh has done is essentially, so back in the day, what Yu-Gi-Oh had and how they actually got to the place that they're at and how they handled their own eternal format, because Yu-Gi-Oh does not have rotations. Yu-Gi-Oh used to have Pot of Greed, the famous Pot of Greed, where you draw 2 cards. Now, what most common people that don't play Yu-Gi-Oh might not know is that Pot of Greed was insanely broken as far as a card goes when you look at any sort of card game design. Because you could play an infinite amount of spell cards in your turn.
Right.
And it draws you 2 cards.
And Yu-Gi-Oh has no mana cost.
And Yu-Gi-Oh has no mana cost. So you can Pot of Greed, draw 2 cards, get another Pot of Greed, draw 2 more cards, whatever.
Keep going.
That's like way back in the day of Yu-Gi-Oh. There's even worse offenders like Graceful Charity and stuff like that. But so you could do, you had those cards. Now, eventually what Yu-Gi-Oh decided to do is actually learn how to design a card game. So what they did...
Are we sure?
They found a solution.
Okay.
All right. It's their solution. And they decided, okay, well, we have all these really strong cards, and we can't keep having a ban list of like 50, 60, 70 very, very specific cards, or like a limited list of you can only have this many copies. It gets too hard to track. So instead, they're going to lock all of the most powerful cards behind these archetypes. Mm-hmm. And so Commander is in a very similar place right now, where everyone has an arcane signet, everyone has a command tower, everyone has all of these very standard cards that are part of these things, where it's like you have a blue staple, you have a green staple, whatever type of deck you are playing. And so in order to get a better hold and grasp for the designers to have a better control over where metas go, where the flow goes of this, they can start basically locking card effects behind each of these individual archetypes. And it's good. Like, it's not about limiting people's freedoms and deck construction and stuff like that.
Right.
Designers need to have a certain hold over what's going to be happening.
Well, it's also the problem again, where I'll bring it back up, where you basically have 2 options, right? You can print things that are more powerful, or you can print things that are more complex, things that are more unique. Right. And so in order to be able to continue to print more powerful cards, you're going to have to gate them off somehow, so that it doesn't just become best in slot for every deck the way Arcane Signet did.
And I also think that where something like Commander is at, other Eternal formats are also here, but where Commander is at in particular is that it sort of needs this new baseline, right? Where you can't have another standard set come out with Shock and have people go like, whoa! Like,
or Lightning Bolt.
Or Lightning Bolt even.
Yeah.
So you need to have this new sort of, what's that one? Like those cards that ended up coming out that were like, you can cast this for free if your commander's in play.
Oh, yeah.
Like that's a really good example of something that's like very, wow, that's really cool. It's very commander specific, but it's very powerful. Right. And that is like perfect example of, I think, the design philosophy that needs to be like honed in on. I think they're already doing it. I just think that this would be another way of possibly doing that. I really personally like the idea of the locking it to planes of existence, and being able to expand upon that, because you can still have a lot of that flavor, and it would allow you to then be able to bring stuff like Kamigawa stuff back, and you can expand upon some of these other mechanics maybe that weren't previously expanded upon.
Yeah. And that way maybe we can finally get more arcane spells.
Finally, we can splice into Arcane even more.
Onto?
I don't know.
Into?
Whatever.
We can soul shift to our heart's content.
Sure.
We can Fox offering.
For whoever gets that reference.
Kamigawa, baby.
Yeah.
Epic.
Epic was one. Epic's an easier one to get, though. That's like not as unique, right?
Fine.
I don't remember what it does.
All right. What are our... we have takeaways? Is this it? We did it? Did we already do it? I guess we already did it.
Parasitic design does not equal bad.
Right.
And in fact, parasitic design in a lot of games cases is probably good.
Can be
good.